Hello there, kia ora. Yesterday, AUT's Research Centre for Journalism, Media and Democracy, or JMAD, has put out its fifth annual report into media trust in this country, and it was fascinating, really fascinating. For a start, media trust levels are at its lowest level ever, and that in itself is not ideal. But what's really fascinating is that 5 years ago, when this started, of the 40 countries that do surveys like this, we were ranked one of the highest in terms of trust, and now we're ranked one of the lowest in just 5 years. In fact, last year saw one of the biggest drops ever of 9%, and that's massive. It's almost like having politicians like Winston Peters who will go on air to threaten media and call them fake, and other politicians who are feeding into lies around things like the Public Interest Journalism Fund, or alternative media outlets like Reality Check Radio or the platform criticizing how journalism works, has an impact on the way that people feel about mainstream media. Who would have seen that coming? In fact, talking about politicians and politicians talking about media is one of the things that drives people to distrust the media, according to the research from this particular survey. And it should be pointed out that with this survey, well, it's done in a really fascinating way. Essentially, they hire a company that sits down with group panels and discusses issues. There's about 1,000 people involved in the process, and so your accuracy will be about the same as what you get for your opinion polls on One News. So it's fairly similar in terms of the numbers that they've got there. But this has a quantitative and a qualitative aspect to it. And so they look at what the qualitative data is saying and how that feeds into the quantitative numbers that they're getting, but it all comes down to, well, how people feel. Because you can't really say one day to the next you feel exactly the same about absolutely everything. And that also should be something that factors into how people read and interpret this particular report. It found things like people believed that left-leaning media was really quite clear, we're a lot more likely to complain about things, despite the fact that our media is much more right-leaning than left-leaning, which highlights again the case that media literacy is a really big issue in this country. One of the other things it really pointed out is that more people were using social media as a platform for getting their news. And I know full well, speaking on this particular platform that I'm talking to you on now, what that actually means. In fact, for a large number of people, for the first time ever, they saw news as a starting point to go off and actually fact check things on social media. And that becomes a bit of a problem because social media algorithms feed back into our own biases. So it's not so much research that's going on there as it is, well, bias confirmation. And that's not ideal because most people don't have the skills to go out and do proper research into what it is that they're seeing on the news. And because they don't necessarily trust what it is that they're seeing. So you see how this all sort of feeds into each other. People don't have the skills and experience, but they don't trust. So they go out and do their own research that feeds into their lack of skills and experience, which means that distrust grows. It's really, really problematic. And that's really well highlighted on the New Zealand Herald story for this particular report, because the Herald decided to put it behind a paywall. And the comments that overwhelmingly came from their top fans, so the people who were most engaged with their page, were all pretty much the same. We don't trust you, so of course you're going to stick it behind a paywall. We don't trust mainstream media at all. But research that's been done over the last couple of years actually highlights that right-leaning media outlets in particular, especially like the New Zealand Herald, which is very much a right-leaning outlet, is much more likely to try and engage audiences more the same way by putting up particularly partisan information around news as opposed to non-partisan products like entertainment stuff. And so they're feeding their own audience this stuff that they already distrust, which builds distrust in the audience because they see it as a bias. It's a really complicated, self-fulfilling prophecy. But research all over the world for years has shown the same kind of thing when it comes to social media and commentary sections. They are a vile cesspit of hate that tends to spread the word a little bit more than traditional media messages would. And at the same time, our politicians are paying attention to it, and what comes through from there gets fed into how they develop policies, which goes on to mainstream media news, which then gets reported. And again, you've got that whole circle that's all self-fulfilling prophecies where we're seeing a continual downgrade of how much people trust the news, how much people don't understand the difference between opinion and fact, what's coming through on social media, those comments on social media, what our politicians are picking up on, feeding back into their own policy division, which then goes through onto mainstream media news, which then gets pushed back on, so the media gets pulled back in from the audience who don't think that they're being fair or honest or unbiased. You see what I mean? It's a hell of a mess. And here's the problem. This is how our media model is set up at the moment. And to break that model and to reset media, to rebuild trust, that's a near impossible task at this stage. We have all been trained on a media diet of how things are supposed to be and look and feel and what gets reported. And while we might not necessarily like a particular bias or we might not necessarily click with a particular media personality, that's still how we're trained. And completely breaking the system and rebuilding it from scratch takes so much work and so much money our media organizations don't currently have to be able to do that in a way that's going to rebuild trust and get audiences back paying attention so that you've got eyeballs on product, which means that you've got money that you can get from advertisers. It's all really big and complicated. And it's not helped by the fact that our audiences here don't know media theory. They haven't been trained up in the most basic skills when it comes to media literacy. And our marketers, they're out there from the media producers going, here's some crap about Taylor Swift because you didn't like what we had to say when the Deputy Prime Minister was mean to us. My God, it's a hell of a mess. But a fascinating report. Just head to the AUT website. You should be able to download it from there.